Hi everyone, this is a supplementary material for your Module 2, Sketch of Feminisms. So in this discussion, I will try to create a more comprehensive account of how feminism existed in our history and how it was used by women, by allies, by academicians in supporting women, in trying to account for the struggles of women. And this is still relevant in our society right now because there are still problems that affect women and girls, and we have to recognize first the problem, and we can do that by understanding the idea of feminism. So this is also a prelude to the celebration of the International Women's Month in March. So happy Women's Month everyone. And it says here in my title, babae ako, hindi ako babae lang. I begin my discussion of feminist theory or feminism by recognizing the bias that it has. So when we talk about feminist theory, it's all about the perspectives of women. And this is due to the fact that historically, women are marginalized, they are oppressed, their voices are not heard. So this is in a way a platform for them to give their voice, to voice out the problems that they still have up to this day. And as we have said here, feminist theory is a generalized, wide-ranging system of ideas about social life and human experience developed from a woman-centered perspective. It is important for us to have this idea because women are historically oppressed. And we can say that in this discussion, it's highly based on the grassroots experiences of women. And of course, we can do that by looking into different approaches or frameworks. And of course, we need the help of the academic community in that. So there is a need for us to look into interdisciplinary and international community of scholars, artists, and activists who really work and pave the way for the creation of this what we call feminist theory or feminism. In the pursuit of knowing the tenets of feminism, we need to ask these basic questions. The first question would be, and what about women? So this first question tries to account for the conditions of women in society. And generally, what we can say about this is that women are invisible in society. Although they are present in social structures and institutions, their voices are not heard, their experiences are not yet really established as compared to their opposite, which are men. So it's important for feminism to look into these conditions to understand the premise, the reason why they are invisible, the reason why they are marginalized. Since we have already established the invisibility of women, we need to ask the second question, why is all this as it is? Why is women historically marginalized? It's because, according to the theory of gender construction, we can say that the idea of gender only started in the 1970s. And this is the reason why we have now platforms for women for understanding their nature, their um, experiences. But before that, we haven't really had a discussion of this. So it's important that we are now discussing this in our discussion of gender and society so that you also know that women are historically marginalized. If women are oppressed, why are we not doing something about it? And that's why we need to ask the question, how can we change and improve the social world so as to make it a more just place for all people? So feminism is not just a theory, it's also a form of activism. It looks into the experiences of women, the struggles of women, and it's not enough that we know them. It's also important that we try to look into ways or create ways, possibilities for women, opportunities for them to anchor or to unleash their potentials as well. And there are different concepts that we can associate to this idea, gender equality, equity. All of this will be discussed later. And naniniwala naman tayo na injustice has no place in the society. So hanggat meron tayong mga injustices, this forms of activism will continue to exist. Although feminism tries to create a general framework concerning women, it's also important for us to recognize the differences among them. So it's not enough that we know that they are women. We also have to look into various social factors that also affect their dominance or their oppression. And we can look at that by taking into account their class, race, age, affectional preference, marital status, religion, ethnicity, and global location. So dito na papasok yung idea natin ng intersectionality wherein makikita natin kung sino ba yung mas na-oppress na babae and what are the factors that play in that oppression or multiple oppressions. So what can we say about feminism? Feminism is not just about women. So hindi lang naman ito tinitingnan yung mga babae, mga conditions nila. It's also an epistemological shift because essentially, or before feminism existed, it recognized the male-dominated perspective in terms of creating knowledge or information of society. So by looking at or by creating this idea of feminism, there is this sense or different perspective on how we look at things. And it's basically from the perspective of women. And this is a revolutionary take because it tries to attack, definitely, it tries to attack existing structures in the society that still perpetuate patriarchy, basta anything that is related to male domination, inaatake nitong feminism in the account or in the pursuit of a more just and humane society. Ito yung ina-attacking idea ng feminism na yung mundo kasi natin, yung foundations niya on truth is that it is universal and absolute. And there's nothing wrong with that. However, these ideas were created by men. And syempre, with that kind of setup, women were definitely not included in the narrative. So there is a need for us to have a revolutionary switch in our understanding of the world. So by 1970s, dito pa lang tayo nagkaroon ng opening of these ideas na possible parang i-debunk yung mga ideas na meron tayo. Aside from feminism being an epistemological shift, it is also a form of activism, or it also has a revolutionary take because it deconstructs established systems of knowledge by showing their masculinist bias. So all this time, yung mga knowledge system that we know to be universal and natural, they have this masculinist bias, and that's the reason why feminism exists, to deconstruct them, to create or to debunk systems that we perceive to be natural. In this formulation, we can say that feminism is highly critical of social arrangements, and it will definitely focus on a lot of variables such as social inequality, social change, power, interests, and beliefs, and of course, the gender socialization processes, the institutions that propagate such ideas, such as, of course, family, law, politics, work, religion, and education. There is this general framework that when we talk about feminism, it's all about women empowerment. However, that negates the structures and historical landscape of feminism. So in this lecture, we will try to create a comprehensive account of how women fought for their rights, fought for what they believed in specific periods. And we have to recognize that to understand how feminism evolved through time and how it can be used in our society today. This is the summary of the sketch of feminisms. And kaya siya ganyan na may mga merong waves kasi during these waves, merong iba't ibang pinaglalaban ng mga babae. And of course, we have to recognize these different platforms or different problems that they recognize so that we know how feminism evolved through time. And tatlo lang siya dito, pero there is this what we call fourth wave, and it talks about feminism in relation to the use of social media. We begin with the first wave. So when we talk about the first wave, it started in the 1830s, and it's all about fighting for the political rights of women. So what are these political rights? So it's all about women's suffrage or the right to vote, the right to education, the right to better employment, and of course, marriage and property laws and reproductive rights. So it's more on the legislation part. Kasi nga, when we talk about first wave feminism, the premise here is that women were not given opportunities in terms of education and employment. So, kaya merong mga conventions like the first convention held at Seneca Falls, and of course the 19th Amendment, which was the result of that convention, of course, created these opportunities or this opportunity for women to vote. However, because of the several happenings in the world, nagkaroon tayo ng parang pagkonti ng paglaban ng mga feminista kasi mas may mahalaga pang mga laban na kailangang labanan like the World War, the Great Depression, World War II, the Cold War as well. So these world wars massively affected, of course, the political movements of women. These are examples of rallies that happen in the first wave of feminism. So, ano yan? Lagi yan nangyayari. Pero ito ay highly concentrated lamang po sa Europe and of course sa United States. This is also a picture of course, women struggling to fight for their rights, to vote, for better education, for employment. Ayan, makikita natin yan sa picture na yan. And the main problem that the first wave feminism address was gender inequality. So ano ba itong gender inequality na ito? Based on the ideals of the first wave feminism, what we can say here is that gender inequality is a result of the sexist patterning of the division of labor. So it's highly on the roles and responsibilities that women and men had before. And liberal feminism, the first kind or the first type of feminism, would argue that in order for us to solve the issue of gender inequality, there is a need for us to repattern our key institutions. So, kailangan magkaroon ng reformatory changes in law, in work, in family, education, and media. So, based on the picture below, or based on the picture, what we can say here is that women are not given opportunities to step up into the ladder as compared to men. And there is a need for us to repattern that. And how can we repattern that? By giving more opportunities for women. Liberal feminism was reflected on the Declaration of Sentiments drafted at Seneca Falls in New York in 1848. So ano ba yung lumabas dun sa Women's Rights Convention na ito? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. So, in a way, because of the inequalities that they experience at that time, there is a need for reformatory changes in law and in custom to allow women to assume their equal place in society. At dito na syempre papasok yung mga key principles natin on liberal feminism. So ano ba yung mga pinaglalaban ng mga feminista nung panahon na ito? Number one, all human beings have certain essential features such as capacities for reason, moral agency, and self-actualization. So, hindi dapat natin dinidivide or dinidifferentiate ang men and women because all human beings have these kinds of features. And there should be the exercise of these capacities through legal recognition of universal rights. So para ma-actualize yung mga potentials natin into actually doing these features, there should be laws. There should be legislations that would protect them. And then, the inequalities between men and women assigned by sex are social construction having no basis in nature. So as we have discussed a while ago on the declaration, we can say here that social inequalities are just social constructions. They have no essential or naturalistic base. So in order for us to create a just or more humane society in this structure, we need to repattern those kinds of things. And social change for equality can be produced by an organized appeal to a reasonable public and the use of the state. As stated, we need to have reformatory changes. And how can we do that? By appealing to the state, by using the state to create more laws, to create more legislations for the empowerment of women. So, merong key figures itong liberal feminism such as Mary Astle and Mary Wollstonecraft. So, sikat yung mga yan. You just need to look at them. To summarize, liberal feminism would argue that women are equal to men. And they are all equal to men because they are all human beings. They are not different from men. And women are equal and separate. And women are not different from each other. There's no distinction here on social classes. Hindi pa nakita ng liberal feminism yung social class. We are all human beings on the basis of our essential characteristics or features. And how do we address gender inequality using the liberal perspective? We need to address it by reformatory changes in using the state. So we need to use the state through parliamentary means. And the identified problems were discrimination, stereotyped gender roles, socialization, and sexism, as stated in the repatterning of yung mga divisions of labor that we already had in society. Although first wave, ang Marxist feminism naman ay merong ibang pagtingin sa idea ng gender inequality. And this is because of the what we call the idea of capitalism. So it's a demonstration of how capital was able to grow by the exploitation of labor. So there is what we call gender inequality because of capitalism. And this capitalism also affects the relationship between men and women. So sabi dito, the production of life, both of one's own in labor and a fresh life in procreation, now appears as a double relationship. On the one hand as a natural, on the other as a social relationship. So meron tayong natural roles for men and women because they need to sustain this capitalistic structure. Dito na nga natin papasok yung aside from the capitalist-worker relationship, meron ding relationship sa household between the husband and the wife. So sa isang capitalistic structure, ang mga lalaki lamang po ang merong kakayahan na makapagtrabaho. At syempre dahil silang makakapagtrabaho, makakalabas ng kanilang bahay, ang mga babae po, ang mga wives, sila po ang mag-aalaga sa kanilang mga anak. And that's why this relationship existed. So, ang idea po kasi ng Marxist feminism, it explores how gender ideologies of femininity and masculinity structure production in capitalism. So, this idea of capitalism created a relationship in the household as well. So, it's not just about the profit now, it's also about the reproductive labor. So, meron na rin syempreng reproductive labor kasi yung mga magiging anak, kailangan alagaan ng nanay, na in a way nakakulong sa kanyang bahay, kailangan niyang alagaan yung mga anak niya para in the future sila naman yung magle-labor. At dahil nga dito sa capitalism na ito na medyo walang pake sa conditions ng tao as long as meron silang napoproduce na mga goods, it really created a different structure of the family. So iniba niya talaga na hindi na lang dapat maging productive yung family, magkaroon ng anak dahil gusto nilang magkaanak. Kailangan nilang magkaanak dahil responsibility yun ng family. Responsibility ng wife and ng husband na magkaroon ng anak para masustain yung capitalistic structure na yun. Para meron pa ring mga workers, para meron pa ring mga bosses in the future. Kaya nga 'di ba, yung mga wives dito medyo mahirap yung role nila because they were excluded in social production and they were not allowed to work and they only had this natural role in a way to be mothers and to be wives to their husbands. And kapag pinag-uusapan naman natin yung setup na ito sa mayamang family naman, itong mga mayayaman naman, syempre, parehas lang din yung condition ng women kasi sila naman, nakukulong din sila and they still had this responsibility to bear children para merong tagapagmana yung boss. Based on this relationship, we can already conclude the key principles of Marxist feminism. So the first would be, women's subordination was neither biologically natural nor God-given. Instead, the class relations of capitalism enforced the gender hierarchies that anchored women's oppression. So women were oppressed because of the structure of capitalism that made them do in a way their roles as mothers and wives. So nakulong lang sila sa bahay dahil dun sa capitalism na yon. And Marxist feminists viewed this patriarchal family as integral to capitalism and thus a site of oppression that must be destroyed. So Marxist feminism would argue that in order for us to create a better world, there is a need for us to recognize that it's a site of oppression. Yung bahay, site siya ng oppression. And how can we solve such issue? For the Marxist feminism as compared to the liberal, which created this idea of reformatory changes by using the state, for the Marxists, it's all about destroying capitalism, the structure itself. So in summary, what can we say about Marxist feminism? In terms of women's identity, women are equal to men. They are not separate as a sex. Sex is not an issue here. The main issue here is yung class nga, yung social class, which differentiates the population. So, pumapangalawang problema lang yung gender, pero yung una talagang problema is yung problema sa pagitan ng mayaman at mahirap, at yun nga yung reason kung bakit patuloy na nag-exist yung capitalism. And in order for us to solve such problem, there is a need to address the state through revolutionary means. Sirain mismo yung estado that perpetuates capitalistic ideals. And what are the identified problems here? Private property and property relations. For further elaboration, you can look at this table. Nagkaroon naman tayo ng second wave feminism as a response to the failure of first wave feminism. Bakit ba nag-fail ang first wave feminism? Because it did not look into the power arrangements existing in social institutions. So although legislations on women's rights were already established, they were not able to translate that in practice. So the goal of the second wave feminism was to translate these basic political rights into economic and social equality. Yung tagline ng mga feminists during this time was, "The personal is the political," because in this tagline, nire-recognize nito na in every relationship that women had before, in this time, they were highly discriminated. So kahit ano pa yan, kahit sa bahay lang yan, all this contributed to, or all these are manifestations of this system of oppression that was existing at this time. And the key concerns of women or feminists is of course to raise issues or consciousness about sexism and patriarchy, gender-based violence, domestic abuse and marital rape, inequalities in the workplace, legalizing abortion and birth control, and sexual liberation of women. So kung mapapansin natin yung mga ina-address na problema ng second wave feminism were highly personal. And because these personal activities or personal problems are reflected on this what we call system of oppression. In a nutshell, ang sinasabi lang ng point na ito ay mas malakas yung power ngayon ng feminism in the second wave because women were now occupying spot in the academe or in the academic community. So when they were already part of the academic community, they were already writing about their experiences, about the unheard voices of women in society. So nakikita na natin yung pagbubukas ng opportunities for women in terms of education, in terms of employment, because of these perspectives that sociologists offered at this time. Example of rallies or movements that happened this time, these are pictures. Ayan. We will discuss them mainly. So, nakita natin yung abortion. It's all about porn. Ayan. Titingnan natin yung mga yan mamaya. And, as compared to gender inequality that first wave feminism tried to address, the problem that second wave feminism would argue for or would account for would be gender and structural oppression. So, ano ba itong gender and structural oppression na ito? Let's begin first with the idea of radical feminism. This is the third sketch of feminism, and this is the radical feminism. So this existed in the late 1960s to reject both the theoretical frameworks and political practice of liberalism or the liberal feminist. Ano ba yung ina-argue dito? Women's liberation cannot be achieved by a theory and practice that make provisions for the rights of abstract individuals irrespective of social class and gender relations. What radical feminists would claim or would argue for is that we cannot really look at us in a similar way, that we are all human beings, because human beings must be put in their spatial and temporal context. And in this context, social class exists, and gender relations play an important part in how we look at ourselves, how we situate ourselves in the society. So hindi enough na abstract individuals tayo. There is a need for us to be aware of where we stand. And in opposition to the second type, radical feminism regards women oppression as the primary and fundamental form of oppression. So kanina sa Marxist feminism, capitalism is the main problem. And because of capitalism, we now have the secondary problem of women being confined to the home and nare-regard lang siya as mother and wife. For radical feminists, they would radicalize that by arguing that women's oppression is the main problem and not capitalism. So in this regard, women's oppression cannot be reduced to class oppression and the economic and social structures of the capitalist mode of production. So it's the main problem that they want to argue for or to fight for. So what are the key principles of radical feminism? The first one would be that women are of absolute positive value as women, a belief asserted against what they claim to be the universal devaluing of women, and that women are everywhere oppressed, violently oppressed by the system of patriarchy. So, as compared to the second way or the second type, which is Marxist, the main problem for radical feminists would be patriarchy. It's not capitalism. And this patriarchy is a structural problem. Ito ang system of patriarchy refers to a system of domination that pervades all aspects of culture, education, and social life and can be found in all cultures and at all moments of history. So irrespective of the social and cultural differences in the world, women are highly marginalized. And this is because of what we call patriarchy. Sa patriarchal kasi na lipunan, mas binibigyan ng value yung mga lalaki. So, it's not just about the violence that are committed to women. It's also about the sense of fashion, the idea of motherhood, virginity, and all of these statements about women. They are all considered to be part of what we call patriarchy. So the image of patriarchy as violence practiced by men and by male-dominated organizations against women, it's not just confined to that because aside from the physical cruelty that women experience, patriarchy can be found everywhere. It is imposed on women. So, kunwari, kapag babae ka, you are required um, to be a mother or to be a good and lawful wife to your husband and you need to do this and that sa sense of fashion mo. Dapat hindi maikli yung sinusuot mo. Dapat virgin ka pa. All of these constructions are part of what we call a system, and that system is called patriarchy. Women are viewed as accessories to men. Women are only secondary to men. They must conform to this idea of what we call patriarchy. So bakit ba ginagawang compliant tools ng mga lalaki ang mga babae? Bakit napakahalaga i-sustain ng mga lalaki ang mga babae? Because their bodies are essential to the production of children. Siyempre, kailangan ng heir, kailangan ng tagapagmana, or kailangan ng susunod ng generation ng kailangan nila ng anak. And they can be also ornamental signs of male status and power. Kapag mas marami kang babae, kapag mas marami kang napapasunod na babae, mas gwapo ka or mas lalaki ka. And they are pleasant partners, sources of emotional support, and useful foils who reinforce the male sense of central social significance. So, in a theater play, for instance, ang bida palagi sa istorya ay ang lalaki. At dahil yun sa idea ng patriarchy, at yung mga babae dito, they are now given secondary roles. Sila lang yung supporting roles. So, ang goal nila is to ensure that the male character would prosper or would develop on his own. So, yun yung nakikita natin problema sa idea ng patriarchy. Tinitingnan lamang ang babae as secondary to men. Dahil nga structure itong binabangga natin, mahirap itong matanggal sa ating lipunan, how is patriarchy to be defeated? So, for the radical feminists, they would claim that it must begin with a basic reworking of women's consciousness so that each woman recognizes her own value and strength. Ang nakikita kasi ng mga radical feminists na ang posibilidad na may mga babae na hindi nila alam na na-oppress sila. And that's because of the patriarchal system na nagre-reinforce ng kanilang blind obedience. And in order for that system to be defeated, there is a need for these women to create separate spaces for themselves. So ang goal o ang solution ng radical feminism to this issue is to create separate spaces for women, separate organizations for women, for them to recognize the problem, to work in unity with other women, to confront any facet of patriarchal domination in businesses, households and communities, etc. So makikita natin dito na pinupush forward ng radical feminism yung mga sororities, yung mga women-led businesses, as long as it's for women and they are separated from men, then patriarchy is defeated. To summarize, what can we say about radical feminism? In terms of women's identity, women are equal to, separate, and different from men. And the focus of activism based on this women's identity would be to address other women. And we can address other women's problem through consciousness raising groups, separatism, such as yung mga women-run businesses, household communities, and love relationships. And the identified problem here would be patriarchy. Yung sistema ng patriarchy talaga. And this is not just manifested in physical violence, it can also be manifested in the standards of fashion, beauty, motherhood, monogamy, chastity, heterosexuality. Lahat ng mga bagay na sa tingin mo ay nagsasabi patungkol sa iyo ng pagkababae mo, at ito po ay galing sa boses or muka ng patriarchy, which is yung mga lalaki, ito po ay problema. And we need to address them through separatism. To translate political rights into social economic equality, pinapakita naman po ng pang-apat, yung socialist feminism, yung pagkakasama-sama nitong mga problema na ito in this what we call structural oppression. So the theoretical project of socialist feminism develops around three goals. The first one is to achieve a critique of the distinctive yet interrelated oppressions of patriarchy and capitalism from a standpoint in women's experience. So, kung kanina ina-identify sila as separate problems, pinapakita po ng socialist feminism yung pagkakapare-parehas nila. And these are structural problems that we need to address. To develop explicit and adequate methods for social analysis out of the expanded understanding of historical materialism by Marx, and then to incorporate an understanding of the significance of ideas into a materialist analysis of the determination of human affairs. Ano ba itong structural oppression na ito? So, hindi lang nito tinitingnan yung isang problema, bagkus tinitingnan nito yung pagkakapare-parehas ng mga problema na iyon. Ano yung nagiging resulta nito sa mga babae? So, in our discussions before, I think you have already seen these problems at pinagsama-sama lang naman sila. So, in socialist feminism, this focus on the structures of patriarchy, capitalism, racism, and heterosexism. And of course, in this kind of system, merong nagdo-dominate at meron yung nagdo-dominate. And we have already seen that in our previous discussion na syempre mga lalaki yung nagdo-dominate. So yan, meron tayong Venn diagram for you to better understand the relationship or the idea of structural oppression. Ayan, itong slide na ito yung nag-reinforce ng idea natin ng structural oppression. Sabi kasi kanina sa Marxist, yung capitalism ay nagresulta sa patriarchy. And what we can say here in socialist feminism is that patriarchy is an independent structure of oppression. So makikita natin yun sa diagram kanina na iba-iba silang oppressions that all contribute to the marginalization of women. At para hindi tayo malito dahil structural oppression nito, ano yung main problem na tinitingnan natin dito? Ito yung paggamit natin ng idea ng domination. Because in all these systems, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, lahat ng mga sistema na ito, merong nagdo-dominate at merong nagdo-dominate. And napaka-importante ng salitang domination dito. Merong subordinate at merong dominant. And yun yung pinapakita nung idea ni George Ritzer. Since pinapakita nga ng socialist feminism na meron tayong iba't ibang structures that perpetuate marginalization of women, what is their solution? The solution is to call for a global solidarity among women. So as compared to the radical feminists which support separatism, for the Marxist revolutionary, the goal really of socialist feminism is to use the state as a means for the effective redistribution of societal resources. So pinapakita kasi sa second wave na merong existing social inequality na nangyayari. And that's the main problem. That's why meron tayong domination, merong mga structural problems. It's because of that. And how do we use the state as a means or as a platform to create a better world for women? There is a need for us to have provision of an extensive safety net of public services such as publicly supported education, healthcare, transportation, childcare, and housing. Dapat mabigyan ng opportunities yung mga women sa ganitong mga bagay para alam nila kung paano sila gagalaw sa lipunan. A progressive tax structure that reduces the wide disparities of income between rich and the poor. Since it talks about the inequalities in society, kailangan talaga ma-reduce yung gap between the rich and the poor. And how do you do that? By taxing more the rich. And yun yung nagiging problema natin, di ba? Parang kapag gender equality or pag equality yung pinag-uusapan natin, pare-pares tayo ng binabayaran na tax or wala na tayong babayaran. Pero in our kind of society, kailangan talaga natin magkaroon ng progressive tax structure kasi mas dumadami yung mga mayayaman. And of course, the guarantee of a living wage to all members of the community. So para ma-actualize natin itong mga women's rights na ito, kailangan maayos muna yung sitwasyon ng mga kababaihan, hindi lang ng mga kababaihan, lahat ng mga tao sa lipunan in terms of their socio-economic status. In summary, what can we say about socialist feminism? The identity of women here is similar to the Marxists because they also view that women are equal to men and they are not separate as a sex because it is the class which differentiates the population. However, it's different from Marxists because for the socialists, the role of the state is given prime importance because we should address problems in socio-economic inequalities through parliamentary means by imposing a progressive tax structure, by giving more opportunities to women or girls, and then, as stated, the identified problems were domination to explain all forms of structural oppression such as white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. Bakit nagkaroon pa ng third wave feminism kung parang maayos naman yung ginawa ng second wave feminism? The first wave and second wave feminisms existed in Europe and in America. So meron talaga silang Western or in a way European-centric biases. And third wave feminism existed because it also accounted for women narratives that were not included in the first and second waves. So ito na yung mga narratives of women of color, lesbians, and working class women. And ito yung mga voices na hindi natin napaipalabas dun sa second wave feminism. And ano ba yung mga key concepts or concerns na hinarap nitong third wave feminism? As stated a while ago, the concept of intersectionality. So it's not enough that we lay down political rights and put it or materialize it into socio-economic forms. It's also important that we look at gender hand in hand with other social economic factors. And by doing that, we also need to change stereotypes, media portrayals, and language used to define women and sexual identities. Kaya nga in rallies and campaigns concerning gender or women empowerment, inaangkla na rin natin dito yung race issue natin, yung iba't ibang issue na kinakaharap ng iba't ibang babae sa lipunan. Kasi iba-iba rin naman talaga yung mga na-experience nilang problema. Halimbawa na lang, yung konsepto natin ng slut, when you are called a slut, kapag babae ka, parang may masama siyang connotation. But then, in this period, we can actually use the term slut to empower women. So parang ano siya, binabaliktad niya, binibigyan niya ng power, ng sariling narrative yung women to fight for their own terms. Na kung dati, in a patriarchal society, pag sinabing slut, masama yung ibig sabihin. Now, we can use slut to empower women. A manifestation of third wave feminism would be postmodern feminism. So ito, pinapakita naman nito or sinisituate nito yung gender in relation to the world that we have right now. So the characteristic in terms of economic is that we are highly influenced by what we call global capitalism. And in this global capitalism, the market is more powerful than the government. So there is this weakening of a centralized state power, the borderless nations. And in this kind of system, nagkakaroon tayo ng technological enhancements And although meron siyang mga negative traits in terms of socioeconomic inequalities, individual proliferations, meron din itong naidudulot na maganda in terms of the liberal social movements. Kasi nga parang nakikita na ng mga tao na there are also a need for us to understand relationships, not just solely based on gender, but also on nationalism, on race, gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, and environmentalism. So sa postmodern feminism, what it tries to argue is that we need to deconstruct, we need to decenter masculinist biases. Yung mga existing arrangements in our society are purely based on the ideas of men. And we always have to know the answer or to the question, whose truth, whose nature, whose version of reason, whose history, whose tradition. So it always comes from the subjective level. Kailangan natin makita kung sino ba yung nagsasalita, kung ano yung mga statuses ng mga nagsasalita na yon. What is the color of her skin? What is her socio-economic status? Saan siya nanggaling? Ano, developed or developing country ba siya nanggaling? Those play an important part in the discussion of women. And sa postmodern nga, since it's postmodern, it tries to attack what have already been established before. Siyempre, inaatake rin ito yung idea or category ng women. Dumadating sa point na kinakategorize natin na mali ang idea ng women. Kasi nga, in that term itself, parang meron na daw innate oppression na nafe-feel yung mga tao once you are categorized as a woman. So, in a way, for them, dumadating dun sa radicalizing point na for the postmodern, kailangan ng, tanggalin yung idea natin ng women. So, sabi dito, the fragmentation within feminism and the paradoxical opposition to feminism from women, whom feminism claims to represent, suggest the necessary limits of identity politics. These identities that we already establish or attach to men or women affect the way we treat them. So, kailangan na, in a way, ang tanong natin dito, tatanggalin ba natin ang category na women? Tatawagin na lang ba tayong Homo sapiens sapiens? This all affect, the identities that we attach all affect how we treat women and men. Another perspective from the third wave would be psychoanalytic feminism. Ito naman yung nagbaborrow ng kanilang framework from psychology, from theories of Freud and his intellectual heirs. And the main problem that they also want to address is patriarchy. And how do they establish patriarchy here? Patriarchy is a universally pervasive system in which men subjugate women durable over time and space. So as insisted in what we call second wave feminism, parehas lang din ng definition ng patriarchy na irrespective of the temporal and spatial context, nag-exist pa rin yung patriarchy. However, iba yung approach na pinapakita nitong psychoanalytic feminism. Ano ba ang approach na pinapakita nitong psychoanalytic feminism? They would now try to look into the idea of or the aspects of the psyche. So the zone of human emotions, of half-recognized or unrecognized desires and fears, and of neurosis and pathology. Here they find a clinically proven source of motivational energy and debilitation, one springing from psychic structures too deep to be recognized or monitored by individual consciousness. So kung kanina sa patriarchy na ina-address ng radical feminism, it's all about this big concept na kailangan nating i-destroy. Sa psychoanalytic, pinapakita niya dito yung importance ng emotions, ng mga feelings that we have because this contribute to the development of this patriarchal structure. So, paano ba nila sasagutin ito? So, in searching for the underpinnings of patriarchy, they turn their analytic lens on the socio-emotional environment in which the personality of the young child takes form into two facets of early childhood development. So, pinapakita ng psychoanalytic feminism in a nutshell kung paano lumalaki yung bata sa isang environment. So, kung paano nakakaapekto yung paglaki ng bata sa itong patriarchal na lipunan na kinagagalawan natin. And these are the two assumptions or two facets of early childhood development. The assumption that human beings grow into mature people by learning to balance a never-resolved tension between individuation the desire for freedom of action and recognition, the desire for conformation by another. So parang ito yung mga hidden motives na laging meron sa mga tao habang lumalaki sila. The observable fact that in all societies, infants and children experience their earliest and most crucial development in a close, uninterrupted, intimate relationship with a woman, their mother, or mother substitute. So pinapakita yung kung bakit accessory lang yung tingin sa babae or secondary role lang sila using the relationship between a mother and her son. So yun yung makikita natin dito kung bakit mababa yung pagtingin sa babae, bakit patuloy na nangyayari itong mothering and child rearing na ito ng mga women. So from the perspective kasi of a male child, from this beginning, the male child growing up in a culture that positive values male, maleness and devalues femaleness and increasingly aware of his own male identity, attempts to achieve an awkwardly rapid separation of identity from the woman or the mother, an emotional separation that is partial and costly in its consequences. In adulthood, the emotional carryover from early childhood toward men, need, love, hate, possessiveness, energizes the man's quest for a woman of his own who meets his emotional needs yet is dependent on and controlled by him. That is, he has an urge to dominate and finds recognition of the other difficult. So ganito kasi yan. Kapag bata yung lalaki, habang bata pa siya, lumalaki siya sa isang patriarchal na lipunan kung saan mataas yung pagtingin sa kanya, napapansin niya yun habang lumalaki siya kasi nga parang nakikita niya yun sa paligid niya at mababa yung pagtingin sa mga babae. At habang lumalaki siya, merong pressure sa kanya na mag-excel dahil ngayon yung sinasabi ng lipunan. At meron ding nangyayari sa katawan niya na parang nagpapakita na dapat medyo lumayo siya sa magulang niya or sa nanay niya specifically dahil hindi sila parehas ang nararamdaman in terms of the growing of the genitalia, in terms of yung mga na-experience niya bilang lalaki. Iba ito sa sinasabi ng kanyang nanay. At habang lumalaki siya, nagkakaroon siya ng idea na parang hindi ito yung buhay na gusto niya. Parang um, meron siyang lost desire na magkaroon ng isang tao na magiging dependent siya doon kasi nga dahil sa kinakalakihan niya, meron siyang nanay na tumutulong sa kanya, naghahanda ng pagkain niya, naghahatid sa kanya sa school. So, nung himawalay na siya sa kanyang pamilya, ang goal niya palagi ngayon ay maghanap ng mapapangasawa na magbibigay sa kanya ng mga binigay sa kanya ng nanay niya. At although we are now trying to change that kind of system, the traditional forms or yung mga social norms natin, ganun yung pinapakita. Di ba pag lalaki ka, parang may responsibilidad ka na ikaw yung magdadala ng pamilya mo, nakikita mo yung nanay mo, tinutulungan ka palagi. Tapos parang may hidden desire ka in your future to have that kind of relationship na meron pa rin mag-aalaga sa'yo. So patuloy na nangyayari yung ganon na patriarchal na lipunan dahil sa social-emotional environment na kinakalakihan natin. Ayan, kapag naman babae ka, same lang din kanina na lumalaki ka at ang nag-aalaga sa'yo ay yung nanay mo. Pero lumalaki ka sa isang kultura kung saan mataas ang pagtingin sa lalaki at mababa ang pagtingin sa'yo. So ano ngayon ang ginagawa ng magulang ng nanay mo specifically? Tinuturuan ka ng gawain bahay kasi nga inaakala ng nanay mo ikaw ay magiging wife in the future na hindi mo kailangan magtrabaho, hindi ka binibigyan ng opportunity na mag-aral kunwari. Kasi nga, alam ng nanay mo na ang magiging kalabasan mo lang in the future ay maging mabuting may bahay. Kaya tinuturuan ka niya kung paano magluto, kung paano maglinis ng bahay. Kaya yon, habang lumalaki ka sa kultura na gano'n, nai-engrave yun sa utak mo na kailangan mong maging submissive sa papangasawa mo, sa mga lalaki sa paligid mo. Kaya, habang lumalaki ka, nakikita mo, ina-idolize mo yung mother mo na in the future, you also want to be your mother na nag-aalaga ng bata, na nagtatrabaho sa bahay, kasi ngayon yung pinapakita sa iyo ng realidad ng lipunan. Ano ngayon yung solution na gustong ipakita ng psychoanalytic feminism para matanggal itong idea natin na ang mother lang daw ay nag-aalaga sa mga bata? Ang mahalagang dapat malaman natin ay yung shared parenting na tinatawag natin para maiwasan yung mga stereotype or yung mga portrayals patungkol sa pagiging husband at pagiging wife. Yung mga bata dapat inaalagaan din sila ng mga kalalakihan o yung mga tatay nila. Para ma-realize ng bata na habang lumalaki siya, hindi naman pala traditional, hindi naman pala natural yung relationship na gano'n, na parang matik na kapag babae ka, ganito lang yung ginagawa mo, kapag lalaki ka, extra domestic task ka palagi. So sa shared parenting na tinatawag natin, makikita natin na parehas yung responsibilidad na binibigay sa lalaki at sa babae. Ito ay nakakatulong din sa socio-emotional environment ng bata na lumalaki siya, na alam niya na ito ay hindi po universal truth. Sa mundong ginagalawan natin ngayon, naglipanan na po yung paggamit natin ng social media. TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, lahat ng mga ito ay manifestasyon o mga sites ng social media, at maaari po natin gamitin ang social media para ilaban ang karapatan ng mga babae. At meron ngang ibang mga feminista na tinatawag itong fourth wave kasi nga gumagamit na tayo ng ibang platform para maipahayag ang damdamin ng mga babae. Halimbawa ng mga hashtags na lumabas upang ipaglaban ang karapatan at ang mga experiences ng ating mga kababaihan ay ang Me Too, o yung kapag na-experience mo yung karahasan, yung pagre-rape, nung sa past ano mo, experiences mo about doon, na nakarelate ka sa isang babae na ganun din ang nangyari, Me Too yun, babae ako, ang pagiging babae ay isang form of empowerment, lalaban ako. Save Mary Jane, ito yung isang bibitayin dapat pero hindi. Na ano lang ako, ito yung kay Tito Soto noon na yun na ano lang, that's a form of discrimination against women. Bakla ako is also considered part of this, a form of empowerment for the LGBT community. Lalo na ngayon na nasa quarantine tayo, hindi tayo makapag-rally on the streets, we cannot really talk about problems with people physically. We use social media not just for entertainment but also to further our political goals. And hindi lang dapat tayo 24 hours na nasa social media just to enjoy ourselves with the pleasures of the world. There is also a need for us to look into these issues and to find ways in order for us to solve them. And social media is a great platform for us to do that. Meron na tayong tinatawag na social media activism. At ito ay naglipa na sa paggamit ng hashtags. So yung mga hashtags natin, kapag nag-trending yan, hindi lang naman yan trending dahil ganito siya. Nagiging trending siya because it has something to do with the affected population. And itong mga trends na ito, they actually impact societal structures, especially the government. When people are heard online, when people voice out their opinions, it's important for the government to hear them out. And it enables conversations and discussions to thrive, and it also aids in the ease of access to threads among social media users engaged in the topic through the use of metadata tag. So, mas nagiging collective yung pag-resolve ng problema kapag gumagamit tayo ng hashtag. Mas nakikita natin yung pinaglalaban natin ay parehas pala sa pinaglalaban ng iba when we use hashtags. So, napaka-importante po ng hashtag when we do social media activism. Kaya nga, di ba, yung mga mass organizations, they also use um, social media as a tool or as a means for them to further their political aims, para magkaroon sila ng impact sa lipunan, para mas magkaroon ng mga taong naniniwala. Ginagamit nila ang social media para ipahiwatig yung mga nararamdaman nila, yung mga pinaglalaban nila. Even the violence says committed against women, pinapakita rin po sa social media para maging aware ang mga kababaihan, ang mga kalalakihan sa mga ganitong nangyayari. However, it's not enough that we click. It's not enough that we fight in the confines of our cell phones. Yun kasi yung critique natin sa collectivism. It does not go beyond the confines of the internet, and as such, could not translate to concrete social action as what the other waves of feminism have accomplished. As compared to other waves of feminism who were able to translate political rights into socio-economic forms. They were able to voice out opinions of women of color, of lesbians. Sa collectivism kasi, ang argument nila dito ay, ano lang yan, sa social media lang yan, pero in actual reality, hindi yan nagmamanifest, hindi yan pinapakita ng mga tao. So yun yung main critic natin sa collectivism. It doesn't go into practice. On a positive note, fourth wave feminism would claim that we can use social media as a platform for us to further our agenda concerning women empowerment. However, it should not stop there. We should only use this as a platform, as an essential tool for us to further our feminist agenda and still actualize it in reality in social institutions, in legal frameworks. So hindi enough na nasa social media ka lang. It's also important for you to interact with women from the grassroots. It's also important for you to account for the experiences and struggles of women in social institutions and to repattern them as well. So yun yung pinapakita ng fourth wave feminism. We can use social media as a tool as a platform. Kaya nga 'di ba meron tayong mga hashtags na nalilipan na ngayon. At itong mga hashtags na ito, kapag naririnig ito ng mga government officials and they do not act upon them, then the problem lies within them. So kapag nakita naman nila na merong pinaglalaban itong mga tao na ito at tama naman yung pinaglalaban nila, there is this parang hinge na they have to work for a more just and better community. So yan, to end this lecture, pinapakita lamang ng social media activism na pwede natin gamitin yung mga hashtags to empower women. And babae ka, hindi ka babae lang. And it's also International Women's Month now, and we have to say that bangon babae. So I hope that this lecture about feminism, the sketch of feminisms, will help you understand the module and will also create an impact in your life. Thank you so much, everyone. This is Leo, and I hope you have a good day.